Okay, so first of all, thanks to the Festival of Lithics for accepting this presentation. Um, as you can see, the title is The Value of Hazel Martingell's Illustration Archive. It's been put together in collaboration with Hazel, and my name's John Piprani. I'm a technician at the University of Manchester. So the aims of this presentation are threefold. Primarily, it's to highlight how important Hazel's personal archive was to me when I was doing the data collection for my PhD research. So really, it's to acknowledge that and to develop that discussion to show how some of the unpublished illustrations within her archive helped me gain a better understanding of Roger Jacoby's research process, or where he was going with his ideas. And the third strand is to suggest that there's an unrecognised box of early Upper Paleolithic lithics that are languishing at either the British Museum or the Natural History Museum. Okay, so the research topic for my PhD was an early Upper Paleolithic transitional industry, a pan-European transitional industry, termed the Lincolnbian, Ranisian, Jers-Manowitzian. And the artifacts that form or comprise this technology were recognised early on. However, understandings of them changed over time. So, for example, Dorothy Garrod, who was a student of Henri Brou, identified these blade points, an example you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. For Dorothy Garrod, they were proto-Solutrean, so they were worked generally on one face, and so she saw them as a precursor to bifacially reduced and produced Solutrean points. In the 70s, John Campbell identified that they were early Upper Paleolithic in date, so they predated the last glacial maximum. He also contributed the term Lincolnbian for the British material. Desbross and Kozlowski recognised similar artifacts in British, German and Polish collections, and so they realised they were looking at the same things just in different areas, and they came up with the term Lincolnbian, Ranisian, Jers-Manowitzian. So bringing together the typologies from the different areas to create one technology. In 2006, Damien Flass published his thesis, and he used radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy to establish the technological coherence of the LRJ. And LRJ is obviously a useful short form that Damien Flass presented. At a similar time, for the British materials, Roger Jacoby published a paper on a site called Beedings, one of the largest sites in Britain and Europe for this kind of material. Really important paper for the British material and largely illustrated by Hazel Martingell. As many of you will already know, Roger Jacoby died in 2009. My supervisor, Chantal Connellar, suggested that this material might be a useful topic for PhD research. So I started my PhD in 2010, part-time, finished in 2016. The Lincolnbian in Britain is largely made up of type fossils. And the type fossils come in two different forms. They're both leaf-shaped points, but on the left-hand side you can see a leaf-shaped point produced by façonnage. So it's been reduced on both surfaces, probably from a tabular nodule of flint. On the right-hand side, you can see a leaf-shaped point produced on a blade. So they've been termed blade points. Usually worked on one face only, and they're produced by debitage. So two different ways of producing a similar end product. In Britain, blade points are by far the predominant artifact. So the corpus I looked at had 21 leaf points and 109 blade points. My analytical approach was to look at metrics, typology, and technology. So metrics, size variation within the corpus. Typology, looking at similarities and differences between the artifacts themselves. And technology, how they were produced. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on metrics and typology. And 130 artifacts, it's not a large corpus. And one of the first things that I had identified through my literature review, but also through visiting local collections and museums with Lincolnian material that were local to me, was that a large proportion, a significant proportion of the blade points were in fact fragments of blade points. So that was the first issue I had to deal with, that I wasn't actually dealing with complete pieces. 8% of the corpus I was looking at was fragmented pieces. The second issue that became apparent as my data collection went on was that a number of key artifacts, i.e. complete artifacts or largely complete artifacts, were missing. So they weren't actually in the museums that they were supposed to be in. So for example, blade points, Balding's Hill was supposed to be at Moyses Hall Museum, but when I was trying to arrange a visit, it was realised that it was no longer, it had been lost. Conningbrook Manor Pit was in a private collection. I had no luck locating that. Leaf points, Soldier's Hole, Cheddar Gorge, I went to the museum, and when the drawer was opened, the leaf points were missing. Same at Ipswich Museum with the white colne example. So I had a corpus, a large amount of which was fragmented, and of the complete pieces, a significant number were missing. So this was really problematic from a data collection. The one thing I had to go on was that all of the above, apart from white colne, had been illustrated for the 2007 Beadings paper. So although they were not in the museum, Hazel Martingell must have had access to them in order to illustrate them. And I met Hazel at a Lithic Studies Society meeting at Frank's house in around about 2013. And I told her what I was up to, and I explained what the problem was. And she was kind enough to offer to let me have access to her personal archive. So I arranged a visit, and I gained access to her personal archive. What we've got next is an extract from a longer video. It's essentially an informal discussion with Hazel. Well, this part is focused on her methods. And I'm keen to promote this because A, it's a record of how she does her illustrations, but B, it also emphasises the fact that These are technical drawings, and the measurements are accurate enough for me to use within my metric analysis, which is what I subsequently did. The third thing to listen out for at the end is how Roger Jacobi would give her the lithics in order to do the illustrations. So those are the key points. Over to Hazel.
Let's go back to your methods. If I was to ask you to illustrate some finds from a site, some lithics, what would be the process? How would you go about it?
That would be lovely. What I do is I do it all on paper, and I do a pencil around the outline, and then I have tracing paper, and I lay that over the flint and trace the main crests between the main flakes and transfer that, but measuring, so I know I've got, because you know there's perspective, so yeah. The ones on the side will be smaller than the ones in the middle, as it were, than they are. And then I'm very fussy about where the flaking has come from, which bit of the edge has the flaking come from, because sometimes with the makeup of the flint, there is a distortion of the curves, which I like to include, but not to lose where the blow for removing that flake comes from, where it is situated. So it's a technical drawing, basically, not necessarily a pretty one.
Yeah. So, and that's all in pencil at this stage?
So I do it in pencil, and then I send a copy of the pencil to whoever is employing me, so to speak, and say, please correct, you know, that you think that's what you want, because sometimes, particularly Roger, wanted something different emphasized. So that's fine by me. And then you alter the pencil drawing, and then if that's okay, you do the inking up of the pencil drawing. Just me putting a pen, I've got a repeater pen, just nice fine point, and I ink up on the pencil lines. So it's the same drawing, but with ink. That's merely for the point of view that pencil rubs and smudges, whereas ink obviously doesn't. It stays crisp and clear, which is what I...
Are you drawing on the tracing paper?
No, that's all on the sort of best smooth drawing paper that you can buy. I've got one somewhere. A pad of pages, A4 pages, and drawing pad. It's a drawing pad.
When I looked at Roger's archive, he used to draw the lithics as he was looking at them. Quite often he used a biro. When you were working with him, did you see his drawings before you did yours, or did you do it separately and then you compared them?
I used to do it separately because he didn't always show me what he'd done. He just passed on the flint and said, draw it, you know. But he'd say which way up he wanted things and how many views. And that's where I learned to do a top view, a back view, and a side view. I always do 3 views, and to get the whole shape of the piece.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated, as you can tell, I'm absolutely hooked on flints, worked flints.
So the important point I want to draw out from that interview was, because Hazel was producing technical drawings for the artifacts I couldn't get access to in museums because they were apparently lost, I was able to take the metrics from Hazel's illustrations. That allowed me to optimize the number of relatively complete artifacts I could include in my analysis. So including Hazel's illustrations allowed me to get data for 24 relatively complete blade points. Looking at length and width, what we can see is for an average size of 100 millimeters long by 30 millimeters wide, the above average artifacts tend to come from the southeast and East Anglia. In other words, areas where flint is available. The below average artifacts tend to come from the East Midlands and the southwest. So the decreased size is not necessarily reflected in increased retouch. So it could also be a core maintenance strategy. But for the purposes of this presentation, the key point is Hazel's technical drawings allowed me to optimize the number of relatively complete blade points I was using in my analysis. In relation to the fragmentation issue, I was able to identify 59 blade point fragments that had over 50% present. And what that meant was that it would include the widest part and the deepest part. So from the width and the depth, I was able to plot another scatter plot and got a similar, little bit more fuzzy result where the above average thickness and width pieces came from East Anglia and the southeast. The below average thickness and width came from the East Midlands, Humberside and the southwest. Roger Jacoby's work, as I've said earlier, was really important in understanding the British materials. And he produced 3 papers, 1980, 1990 and 2007. And it's really interesting to see how the number of sites for Lincolnbian material increases through those 3 papers. And what in the 2007 paper, we get an indication of where he's going with his analysis. So he states, in relation to the blade points from Baldings Hill, Warren Hill, Conningbrook Manor Pit and Batchild, he says it's interesting to observe how different each is from the others. So he's becoming really interested in difference and how the artifacts vary from each other. So on the one hand, he's building up a more focused understanding of the corpus, and in doing so, he's recognizing how different some of the pieces are from each other. And to go back to Hazel's corpus, some of the unpublished drawings reveal a similar pattern. So, for example, the blade point on the left that's unpublished and housed in Bolton Museum, that's from Kent's Cavern, but it's made from green sand chert, so it's an unusual example. On the right-hand side, there's a blade point that's been burinated, and again, it's been illustrated, so it's been borrowed, Hazel's illustrated it. However, it's as yet unpublished. A similar story with the leaf points. The one on the left, I didn't get access to. However, it was in the process of being returned to the Isle of Wight, and so it wasn't accessible to measure. However, Hazel had already illustrated it. The White Colne Pit artifact that I went to see in Ipswich Museum and that was missing, Hazel has an unpublished illustration of it. And in a 2011 posthumous paper, there's an illustration that Hazel had a copy of that's been published of the Cross Bank leaf point, which is one of the biggest artifacts within the corpus. And in it, there's a really interesting point where Jacoby and Hyam argue that some of the leaf points currently categorised as Lincolnbian may in fact be Solutrean, as previously argued by Dorothy Garrod, suggesting that some of the dating might allow us to understand some of the leaf shape points differently. So this focus on difference and illustrating the complete corpus was allowing new ideas about the Lincolnbian, its coherence and its variability to emerge. So for the final section, I'd like to just return to the missing lithics. Leaf point wise, at the Soldier's Hole collection, there should be 3. At least 2 of them were expected to be in the museum and they were lost. The same with White Colm Pit at Ipswich Museum. Blade points, Baldings Hill, unable to be found at the Moyses Hall Museum, and the Conningbrook Manor Pit was in a private collection. However, all of these artefacts had been illustrated by either Hazel Martingell or Jules Cross. So at some point, Roger Jacobi had had access to them, and so had Hazel Martingell and Jules Cross. And if we look a little bit more closely at 2 examples, so for Soldier's Hole, Philip Hendy, who I was dealing with at the Cheddar Man Museum, suggested they may have been borrowed in 1986. The artifacts seem to have been illustrated by Jules Cross probably between 2004 and 2005, to his best recollection. The illustrations appear in Jacobi 2007, and they're referenced there to the Cheddar Man Museum. But as I say, in 2012, when I visited, they were no longer there. And if we look at the Baldings Hill blade point, the person I was dealing with, Chris Mycock, thinks that it may have been borrowed by Roger sometime in the 1980s. It was included in Roger Jacobi's 1990 publication listing, so it was on his radar by then. Hazel has a copy of the illustration with a request for return of the object from Roger, and that's dated to 1990. It was not present in a 2002 internal museum inventory, and the Pamela archive, so the archive of Roger's notes, states it should be at Moyses Hall Museum, which it isn't. And that is also reiterated in Jacobi 2007. So it would seem as though at least some of these artifacts were borrowed for analysis and for illustration. And because Roger died in 2009, he may well have not had a chance to return them. So there's the potential that they are still either at the British Museum or the Natural History Museum, both of which Roger worked at. And this is something that Matt Pope is looking at the moment to try and see if there is a box of early Upper Paleolithic artifacts sat on a shelf somewhere that nobody's aware of. Final slide. If anybody is interested, I've put the 50-odd minutes interview with Hazel on YouTube. So if you go onto YouTube and type in Hazel Martingell, you'll go straight to it. And a large portion of it is about her life, but also crucially other people that she's worked with. So she didn't just work with Roger Jacobi. And so there is a range of her personal archive doesn't just cover the work with Roger, but also work with people like Alan Saville, Jill Cook. So it's probably of interest to a number of people, and Hazel's very open to dealing with researchers who've got particular research questions. So thanks to Hazel for helping me out with my PhD process, and thanks to the Festival of Lithics for accepting this presentation.